Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for our weekly chat on geopolitics and markets is Rob Larity, who's our chief investment officer. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot to say. If you haven't rated this podcast and you like it, please consider rating it. I know from the statistics that hundreds of you listen to this podcast on your iPhones. And if you all went to the podcast itself and hit 5 stars, you have no idea how much it would help us. So if you have a couple seconds to spare before we get into the meat of the podcast, open this up on Apple Podcasts, hit those 5 stars. You'll be doing us a huge favor, and I will buy you a beer wherever you find me in the world, and I'm good for it. So without much further ado, write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions, comments, concerns about this podcast or anything else you've heard here. Otherwise, cheers, and we will see you out there. Cognitive Investments, LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Coming to you live from somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, I'm Jacob Shapiro as usual. Rob is joining me from Cambridge, back from France. Rob, how's it going?
It's going well, Jacob.
Well, I'm looking out at my childhood home where there are free-range birds of all types roaming around. Geese, a white peacock just walked by. Not that the listeners need to know that, but just so you get a feel for the the diversity of experience that you get on this podcast. Anyway, enough rambling. Rob, it's actually hard for me to know exactly what's going on with markets because I'm here with the birds. Why don't you give me a little bit of insight from your perspective about the biggest development in markets this week so far?
Yeah, so back near the end of May, we were talking about how all the news is terrible and that's why you should be optimistic.
Yeah.
And now that's starting to play out. So markets are rallying, and the question that's, on Twitter and on everyone's minds is this a little bear market rally, or is this going to have some legs? It seems like the consensus is this is just a little bear market rally. And I just want to talk about that a little bit because I don't do this very often, but I want to draw your attention to a very specific stock today as an illustration of much bigger things. So I want you to look at DR Horton, and the ticker is DHI. And this is an important one. So DR Horton is a home builder that focuses on entry-level home buyers for the most part. And the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of investors have been chasing these cyclical consumer stocks, consumer companies that have just gotten destroyed in the last 6 months. And I know a lot of people are looking to short them here and chase them down. They feel like easy trades. And the question on everyone's minds is, well, the consensus numbers on Wall Street are still way too high. So they're going to miss numbers. The economy is slowing down. This is a sure bet. And, we've been talking with our clients and with others and sort of stressing some caution around that. And today, I think, is a very interesting example because DR Horton came out and the Wall Street expectations were for them to record about 19,500 new home orders for the quarter that just passed. And they ended up getting under 17,000 orders, which is a huge miss. And they lowered their revenue projections for the full year. They came out and said the cancellation rate on new home orders has risen to 25%. Last year, it was only 17%. In 2005, it got as bad as 40%. So just to put things in context. So by all accounts, a giant whiff relative to what was expected by Wall Street. And if you look at DR Horton's stock price today, it dropped like a stone on the opening, given all that information hitting. And now it's up. It's up pretty good on the day.
Yeah, like
and
almost
that's the
4%.
environment. Yeah. That's the environment that we're in. The bad news is in, and when markets can't go down on bad news, that's a sign that they want to go up. Not to oversimplify. So that's, I think, an important thing to focus on. And why is that? Like, what's happening in the economy? We've talked about, and I've used the word volatility so many times in the last month, that this is not 2001. It is not 2009. You don't have a sort of debt deflationary crash that's happening in the economy. And it's very easy to listen to the people who make those claims during these times because markets are getting throttled. Everyone's gloomy and scared, and those views get a good hearing. But again, it's not like that. And it's really back to the 1940s that you should look for something of a mental model for what this should look like. And in the 1940s, it was a period of volatility in both directions and shocks. No big crashes, no huge economic slowdowns, no runaway inflation that stays in place for years and years, just seesaws back and forth. And now you're starting to see the seesaw in the other direction. And a few things catch my eye. If you look today, bonds are up a lot. Bond prices are up. So yields are coming down. Bond prices bottomed about a month ago already. And we talked about this. You mentioned last time that, hey, the Fed is looking at the current inflation print, and that's backward looking, and they should be forward looking, right? And that's exactly the issue, because the market is starting to price in some of these deflationary aspects of what's happening now. So gasoline prices, I don't know if you've been watching this. I know you're keeping an eye on it in Louisiana, but gasoline has really come off the boil.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask when you were talking. So, like, how do we think about that in terms of commodity prices? Because in some ways, it seems like we also had the peak in some of the commodity prices. They've really been declining considerably, and it's across the board: metals, agriculture, energy commodities. So much so that it almost seems like the consensus I'm reading on my Twitter or even talking to people is that you're getting all these folks who want to be short energy, which you and I were talking about on this podcast, which you were talking about on this podcast 2 months ago. And I wonder how you put that into what you were talking about with the psychology of markets, because does that mean that if the market is priced in the low and the seesaw is going back up, does that also mean that we should see commodities sort of hit a level here and then also start to ascend from here? Or am I thinking too simplistically about that and there's something more complicated that I'm missing?
No, I think that's right. I don't know about timing on the commodities. I think it's a little premature to go and say, hey, these things are going to turn around tomorrow. But the seesaw is moving in the opposite direction. And a few weeks ago, I said, what you want to do as an investor in this environment for the next decade is you want to find the extremes and you want to fade the extremes. You want to do the opposite of the extreme move, because when it hits the extreme, everyone is going to start talking about, hey, you can project this forward and it means this extreme outcome and you should try to be long or short that. It's not going to be like that. So, right now, people are looking at jumping on the short commodity bandwagon. I wouldn't do that. In full disclosure, we closed our energy stock short yesterday after putting it on at the end of May. So that's what we're trying to do from a tactical standpoint. The fact is, markets are very forward-looking, including commodity markets. A lot of those commodities have already come off really, really well. And the fact that risk assets are rallying now, I think is a sign that markets are looking beyond that demand destruction to something that's more normal, something that's more healthy, and that's a good thing.
All right. Well, I think I know how to tee you up here. Let's see if I've read the room correctly here. So, how do we square that with the Fed talking about 100 basis points and then another 75 after that or even more? Because not only is the Fed seemingly looking at the last month's inflation print, but it looks like they're going to get even more aggressive. So I guess it's a two-part question, actually. How do we think about what the Fed is now telling us about 100 basis points? And then number two, is the Fed powerful enough to kill the rally that you're talking about if they do keep on with interest rates? Or do you think the rally is resilient enough and that the Fed is just kind of blowing in the wind?
Well, I think the reason, in part, why risk assets are rallying, why stocks are rallying so much, is because those more extreme scenarios are coming off the table, it looks like. So it's funny, if you look at the current question in markets is, oh, well, is the Fed going to do 50 basis points at the next meeting? Are they going to do 75 basis points? How aggressive are they going to be? And today, the new jobless claims number came out, which comes out every week. And people have been watching this creep up just very slightly. And today it had a very noticeable jump from a very low level, like nothing you would pay much attention to. But that's an important sign, because the Fed is watching that for signs that the employment situation is starting to weaken and break, because that's what they're effectively trying to do. They're trying to put the damper on labor inflation, among other things. And that indicator, which is a backward-looking indicator, because employment is backward-looking, that indicator is giving the Fed license to say, okay, let's chill a little bit. And the market really likes that. And that's in part why bonds are up. And we can see this, again, we always say it's so important to be on the ground like we are. We're not just looking at numbers and statistics. We're connecting that to on-the-ground realities. So this past week, we were in Indiana doing field research with some manufacturers. And this is a classic case, because this is a manufacturer that had a huge backlog of orders that it was rushing to fill toward the end of last year. So when we went to this same place, these guys were desperate to hire anyone that they could get their hands on. Now it's a totally different story. The backlogs are weakening. They have a glut of inventory, and now they're starting to fire people. So the statistics connect to the anecdote, which connects to what the Fed observes, and then markets observe what the Fed is doing, and it's looking out 9 months in advance and saying, okay, extreme rate rises are off the table. Let's go for it.
Is there anything more you want to say about U.S. markets before I pitch the perfect segue into the rest of the world on that? Or was there something else you wanted to hit?
Well, I guess the only other little anecdote that I thought was interesting this week, just on this notion of volatility and the seesaw effect, is there was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal about Hasbro, the toy maker, and how much inventory that they had built up this quarter. So they built their inventories to the highest level they've ever been. And the reason why they did that is usually Hasbro is building their inventories much later in the year, because so much of their business is tied to Christmas. And this is an interesting little observation to make, because all of the Christmas inventory build is happening much earlier this year. So everyone knows, and we've talked about it for months now, that companies like Walmart and Target had way too much inventory, and then they were looking to dump it. And that was a big drag on growth in the first quarter, and it's been a big drag on growth. Now you're starting to see the opposite. In anticipation of the holiday season already, you have companies that are starting to build again their inventories. So that inventory cycle is getting pulled forward. That's going to be a bolus for growth, not only here, but also in places like China that are big manufacturing exporters of especially consumer goods and that sort of thing. So it's not all gloom and doom, and you do see these factors moving in both directions, and the seesaw is in effect. So that's how you got to think about things from an investment standpoint, is anticipating, not taking any trend and extrapolating it too far, because every trend sows its own demise, or sows the seeds of its own demise, rather.
Yeah. This is also the point where the conversation gets so meta that it starts to make my brain hurt, because because I feel like one of the implications of what you're saying, and one of the things I've learned working with you, is that by the time something hit, and this is true of geopolitics too, by the way, by the time something hits the front page, it's usually old. So if I'm ahead of a game in my own world, for example, on geopolitics, it's because I read a local newspaper in a local language and translated it. And 7 days later, you might see that on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, or even on page 7 of the Wall Street Journal, translated into English and missing the most important developments. But if you want to kind of get ahead of the curve, start reading those local papers. You've kind of showed me that the same thing works with financial markets. By the time Barron's is writing something up about DHI, that stock that you were talking about earlier, or anything else, it's probably too late, and the flip side of the coin is already in. Although we are technically part of the media landscape too, so is the fact that we're talking about it mean that it's already out there? And it starts to hurt my brain. I sometimes don't know how you keep it all in your brain a little bit. It's I was talking to Roger Baker, my old teacher at Stratfor, and Rain, who he's coming on this podcast actually in a couple of weeks, and we were talking about how the analyst or investor personality, you have to have incredible hubris and humility at the same time, and those things really do have to coexist in your brain at the same time, because otherwise you're going to get trapped. I don't know if there's a question in there. It doesn't have to be a question, but I don't know. I sometimes struggle with the fact that we're part of the media ecosystem, but then once we say the thing out loud, or are we already starting that avalanche towards it being old news?
Well, what I find very refreshing is I would never want to just talk. I would never want to just do this, because this is so, it doesn't do anything. And the, how do I say, the discipline of being a researcher or an analyst or a pundit, I enjoy that, but without the discipline of actually having to implement things in a portfolio, implement things in the financial markets, which is a completely different skill set. Completely. You could be wrong 70% of the time and still do really well, because it's all about discipline, position sizing, risk reward. How much do you make when you're right? How much do you lose when you're wrong? Whereas this game is all about who's going to sound smart, who's going to say the right things, and when they say stupid things, successfully sweep them under the rug. And I never said that. You misinterpreted me. And that's fine. And people like that, and it's enjoyable. But without that grounding, I would feel completely lost.
Yeah, and just to your point on that, Rob, I also don't. I think one of the ways that we establish credibility is that we don't just pat ourselves on the back. You talked about how we covered that energy short, and that was really all you. I was actually skeptical of you at the time when you started talking about the energy shorts, because I was in the geopolitical world, and geopolitics was all, oh my God, energy prices are going to go to 300 because Russia's going to cut everything off.
I can tell you were giving me the hairy eyeball in the research meeting.
Was I? Well, I bit my tongue. I was like, I think he knows something more than I do in this particular moment. But an example actually of where we were even right, and we were talking about it, but we didn't end up figuring out how to do it, was cotton. Because we thought we wanted to short cotton. We were looking at it for a long time. You and I kept missing each other on the research end of it. And then the bag fell out from underneath it, even though we'd been spending mental energy on it and writing about it for 6 months. So you might be thinking that we made a lot of money on a cotton trade if you've been listening to me or reading us for the past 6 months, but that was actually an example where we didn't. So, and to your point, in some ways, I learned more from that than the energy situation, because that was, we sort of have to do an after action and look at each other and say, hey, we were like 95% of the way there, but because we didn't get to that 5% discipline, we missed the bag. So what do we do next time to make sure we capture that sort of thing?
Yeah, and that's the story of being an investor, unfortunately. I don't want to say missed balls, but the pitches you don't swing at that turn out to be very fat.
Yeah, but it's all about shots on goal, and as long as 51% of the shots are going in, you're probably going to be. Is it 51%? What percent of the shots have to go in for you to feel like you're batting at a good average? To mix my metaphors there horribly.
Well, believe it or not, it's much less than that. So if you look at successful investors over time, the typical batting average is usually less than 50% and closer to like 35-40%. Like if you look at someone like George Soros, who is the guru of macro and everyone views as this brilliant figure, and he is a brilliant figure, but he was wrong most of the time. And if you listen to the people who worked with him directly, that's the number one thing that they talk about was his humility, his willingness to immediately just pull the plug on anything that he was in. He was, I'm wrong, and turn around, and sometimes he would do the opposite. But his batting average was substantially below 50%. And same with Stanley Druckenmiller and these really great figures. The difference is discipline, position sizing, when you're wrong, not losing too much, and when you're right, to recognize it and really capitalize on those moments.
Pivoting a little bit, we were talking about the Fed. I thought this might be a nice segue to talk about what's going on in Europe right now, because we're recording on Thursday. This will go out tomorrow. Probably it'll go out a little bit later, listeners, because of my own personal scheduling problems. Though I think our producer editor will try to get it out quickly. But if it's a few hours late, it's my bad. Hopefully, you guys can get through your morning commute without listening to our sweet dulcet baritone voices. But the ECB announced today that they're raising interest rates 50 basis points, not the 25 basis points that they telegraphed before. They also unveiled their new mechanism for trying to curtail the spread in yields between peripheral European countries' debt and the EU itself. They had only been talking about it in sort of mythical terms up until this week. And I mean, I've read the release about this new transmission protection instrument. It's still a little bit mythical to me. Well, not mythical, but it's still a little bit abstract, except for the fact that it seems to be very clearly indicating to me that the European Central Bank in particular is preparing for a clash between countries like Germany and between the peripheral European states, because all of the sort of things that they're saying have to be in place before this mechanism triggers. It's all about debt and deficit spending or debt levels, and is this country actually following through on what the European Union says, and are they following certain bylaws? They have to have an absence of severe macroeconomic imbalances. Find me a European country without economic imbalances. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I was wondering what you thought about the ECB raising rates to 50 basis points to the 25 basis points, because it doesn't seem to me that 25 basis points makes a lot of difference in the grand scheme of things. If you're really afraid and you really want to hike, maybe you should hike and not telegraph the 25 basis points. So what did you think of kind of the ECB, especially coming off last week with the euro and dollar going to parity and everybody freaking about that for a couple days?
I don't know if I have anything too deep to say on the rate hike itself. On the mechanism, I don't think it's that important, frankly. If you look at mechanisms that they've rolled out in the past, oftentimes they haven't even used them. So much of that is a confidence game. So much of that is convincing market participants that the ECB is going to step in if anything truly problematic happens. And again, as Draghi said in 2012, we're going to do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone intact.
Yes, Draghi, now the former prime minister of Italy. I mean, the European Central Bank could not have timed the release any better, because you're right. If it is about a confidence-building measure, how great that you can balance the headline about Draghi taking it on the chin and the Italian government going down and having to go to elections in September, October, then the ECB coming out and saying, we have a mechanism, don't worry, like we'll be able to sort of fix the spread in yields before it gets there.
Well, do you think that there's any significant risk that Italy is going to be kicked out of the EU or kicked out of the Eurozone, or there's going to be a major financial or liquidity crisis in Italian sovereign debt?
No, I don't think there's any risk of Italy falling out of the EU. And I think this is a classic example of the difference between domestic politics itself and geopolitics. Italy has, I don't want to say dumpster fire, I want to say something nicer. Italy is one of the more unstable governments in the European Union. It's one of the more unstable democratic governments in the world. They seem to switch leadership quite often. And the fact that they didn't switch leadership, that they appointed a technocrat basically like Draghi to maintain the shop, I think, was a reflection of the fact that the EU was going through two crises at the same time. You had the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that was happening with that. And you had this Russia-Ukraine war, which prolonged it a little bit. And in some ways, the fact that they've unseated Draghi and they want to go back to elections sort of tells me that, okay, like politics in Italy is back to normal. This is the normal. This is how Italy should be in terms of its politics. And we've just gotten used to this idea that it's going to be stable for a while, but now it's going to be a little bit more unstable. I will say, though, that you can see already the ECB and the European Union is drawing some clear battle lines. So the reason that people are upset, or upset is the wrong word, the reason that people are nervous or lacking confidence as a result of Draghi leaving is because a lot of the EU plans to give aid to Italy over the next couple of years was dependent on them putting through some reforms that they thought only Draghi was going to be able to push through. And he's not going to be able to be there for that. So on the one hand, you have the EU saying it's not about Italy crashing out of the EU. Is the EU going to provide the 200 billion euros or however much it is as part of the recovery and resilience plan that was approved under the proviso that Draghi will be reforming Italy's business sector and some of its rules about social programs and things like that. And I think the thing that's interesting about the mechanism and in general about the ECB's language is they're starting to say, hey, we need a little bit of fiscal responsibility. This is not going to be a blank check, because if they just say it's a blank check, you might have an Italian government that gets elected and starts taking whatever they want, and nobody in the EU wants that. The other piece of this, though, is that, and this is the one where I'm a little less sure of myself, which is that if the elections were held today, the center-right looks like it has a pretty commanding position in the polls. Now, it's not just one party, and even on the center-right, some of those parties don't like each other and are competing with each other. But that's where Euroscepticism is in Italy. I think that those center-right parties are weenies and wouldn't turn away from the European Union. And like you said, the European Union will do whatever it takes. But if we're talking about investor sentiment and confidence, if you saw somebody like Salvini or some of these center-right parties entering the pole position for the premiership in Italy, then you're a little more uncertain about what are those negotiations between the European Union and Italy going to look like? Who's going to compromise more? Who's going to blink first? That sort of brinkmanship is there. So, but that's all politics. Like, the geopolitics actually doesn't change just because an Italian government falls. Like, it's still the EU needs Italy. Italy needs the EU. If either one of them pulls away from each other, it's going to be much worse for those actors, and all the leaders on both sides know that. So if geopolitics holds, and if it beats back against the political situation, then the politics will be fireworks. There'll be, like you sort of said, there'll be things to fade and things to lean into based on how things are going at the political scenario. But nothing has technically changed today just because Draghi is no longer prime minister.
Well, thankfully, at this house, we invest based on geopolitics and not politics, right?
Well, hopefully. I mean, not a lot of people have done this before, so we are making a bet that this is a thing that is going to be good for investors in the long term. But yes, we're trying to focus on those things that don't change so much, and navigate these things without freaking out. Because I think a lot of people who don't know anything about Italy today are just opening up the Financial Times and saying, oh my God, the Italian government fell. Everybody said the Italian government wasn't going to fall. I don't know if you noticed this also, though. Something weird happened on social media just the last couple days, which was, you can tell that the front pages of the newspapers like the FT and the Wall Street Journal, they all love Draghi. They love Draghi because he talks their language. He's a technocrat. He's thinking about markets and things from that point of view. But there was this weird segment of social media, both in English and Italian. Not that I speak Italian, but I can hit Google Translate really well with a button. That was talking about how, Draghi's the technocrat, and this is technocratic fascism, and Italy is the example of what happens if we let the technocrats rule the world. And that was also a weird, not a weird narrative. That narrative's been out there before, but it was strange to see that sort of emerge in the last 2 or 3 days. I have no idea who's behind that narrative, if it was just grassroots, if something else was kind of poisoning the well, but I did notice that was making the rounds a little bit. And I think that might be one of the reasons Draghi pulled out, because he was not able to convince the other Italian parties, that his way was the way to go. Those parties think that they have a chance now in elections to have more political power for themselves.
Well, not to veer off into that direction, but I find that comment pretty interesting. And I want to, it's a nice segue into a book that I read while I was on vacation, which was The Revolt of the Public. Have you heard of this? By Martin Gurri?
No, I've heard Revolt of the Masses by Ortega y Gasset, but I don't know the one you're talking about.
So I think this is an homage to Ortega y Gasset that was written pretty recently. But it makes, I think, a very convincing case. And that case is essentially that the emergence of social media, the emergence of the internet, has made general populations all over very distrustful and disliking of perceived elites, perceived technocrats, perceived specialists, experts of all kinds, in part because the flaws of and wrong opinions and mistakes of these people can be examined with such scrutiny now, can be exposed so easily, and that the prior system that had emerged, the industrial system, as he calls it, was based on sort of a hierarchical view of, okay, here are these people, they've jumped through all the hoops, they went to Harvard and Stanford, and they know, what they're talking about, and, you should respect them and listen to them, and that's breaking down. And I guess, do you find that convincing? And do you think that could be part of why a lot of Italians don't like Mario Draghi?
As someone who, for personal reasons, had to spend many hours on the phone with the U.S. government this week and at a Social Security office, the idea that the technocrats are smart enough to do any of the things that people are imputing them with is laughable to me. But no, I mean, I think I see both sides of that. I can kind of understand doubting experts and technocrats, especially because we live in and this, I think, is a byproduct of the nation state itself. Like, the larger states get, the harder it is for central governments to actually do things that local populations feel are in their interest. It's harder to get that connection between what is happening at the central government level and what's happening on a local level. This is particularly true in the United States, which is why the United States has always been such an interesting example of democracy at work, because what's happening in Washington really has nothing to do with what's happening in rural Louisiana or in Fargo, North Dakota, where I'm going to speak to some farmers in a couple months. I mean, if you actually travel the country and see what's happening, to your point, on the ground in different places, it doesn't matter what's happening in Washington. It doesn't actually affect anyone. But I find in general, though, what you're really talking about, and it comes in different guises, and social media is using it for its own purpose now, but this is really about populism. And populism is a very malleable word, and it can mean a lot of different things. But for me, it means folks are appealing to people's fears and suspicions because whatever the zeitgeist is in the moment, people are not feeling optimistic about the country. And so I do think that there are media narratives on both sides. This is the right and the left. I'm not going after Fox News or MSNBC. I actually think they're both part of the same problem that we're talking about here. And this is true also in any other country. But everybody has their tribes and everybody's going to their thing. And what sells is, hey, there's this thing that's terribly wrong. There's this huge injustice, and everybody needs some kind of boogeyman to say this is what to blame. And technocrats is nobody gets offended if you blame the technocrats, right? There's no technocratic lives matter movement. It's a pretty safe thing to go after if you're trying to blame someone for something, but not get any blowback from anyone else, because the technocrats are small. The last thing I would just say, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I think this is particularly actually problematic in the European Union because the European Union is in of itself a huge bureaucracy. And I think there are bureaucrats in the European Union who think the European Union is all that matters, and who did look down on local governments and local politicians. I think that's some of the reason you have the governments you have in Poland and Hungary. It's certainly why you have a character like Salvini. And what we're really going to find out here in the next couple of years, or really just in how the EU is going to deal with Italy, is, have they learned anything? Did they learn everything from their almost Grexit? Did they learn that the technocrats, if they only speak in the language of these pretentious sounding press releases from the ECB, then the European Union is in trouble and we're wrong. But they're going to have to think a little bit more about, hey, like if we're an example that you brought up before we got on the podcast, if they want to reduce natural gas consumption by 15% and Spain says no, what's the next move for the European Union? Are they going to ridicule the Spaniards as, salami eating, irresponsibly spending folks who just want to have a siesta? Or are they going to engage and say, okay, like a major member state here is telling us that this doesn't work for them politically. We need to work with them on that level. So I somehow danced around a lot of different things and didn't answer your question, but that's that's the best I got.
Well, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Macron in that vein, right? Because it's interesting that he's survived for as long as he has, and he did win the election again. Whereas in other European countries, you've seen figures that are like Marine Le Pen be elected or come into power, or parties like the Five Star Movement in Italy have great success and effectively governed in the majority. Why? What is his secret sauce? Do you think that he's done something that can be emulated by a Mario Draghi type figure elsewhere in terms of incorporating what the populists want into what is, in Macron's case, an admittedly very elitist, presidency? I mean, he's the elite of the elite.
Yeah, I mean, you were just in France, so you might have more insight than me. But so I'll just say on the Italy point, the center right really hasn't done anything for the last 10 plus years. They keep on threatening. They're in the polls. It's going to be Salvini, and then it's not. Then they blow it because when people actually get to the voting booths, they think, "Oh, what do these guys want to do? Do I really want this? Like, it feels good in the moment, and when I'm joking with my friends and having some wine, like, yeah, I can say about how I hate all these technocrats, but then I have to have Salvini leading my country. There's some break there. Macron, I mean, you said it. I'll make it sharper. I mean, what a pretentious guy Macron is. He really, really is like kind of a snob. But I will also say, and I've said this before, he's also arguably the most strategic leader, certainly in Europe and maybe in the world. He's up on my top five list of global leaders who think about geopolitics, who understand geopolitics, and has a coherent worldview about how to do that. Where he fails, of course, is in communicating and relating to other parts of the French electorate. I think he has been he's a benefactor of the reality that there's nobody to challenge him in France, and that his main competitor has the last name Le Pen. If her last name wasn't Le Pen, and if she wasn't carrying the albatross of her father around her, I'm not sure that she would have lost all these many times. And if she really cared about the ideals that she's talking about, I think she would find another figurehead to run in her stead, because I think at least when I've been in France before and talked to people, they're very, very sympathetic to some of the things that she talks about, but they all will tell you, but she's a Le Pen. Like this, I would rather deal with the pretentious asshole than with this person who is associated with this really fringe, crazy group that it's just a pale beyond. So I think Macron has benefited from the way that French elections work and how it always gets Le Pen to the second round, but then she can't complete the conquest. We also, though, are going to find out what kind of political instincts Macron has, because he doesn't have the majority now as a result of the legislative elections. Like the results of the two rounds of elections, the presidential versus the legislative, kind of bear out my point. He beat Le Pen head to head, but in the legislature, he didn't do particularly well. And maybe if you're an optimist, that moderates him and he starts reaching out and compromising and messaging a little bit better. I don't think he has that in them. I think he is who he is. He's got his positives and his negatives, and he's not going to be able to translate it into anything. So he's a great example. But what do you think? And what does Juliette, your wife, think, who is actually French?
Oh, she hates Macron. she says he's an elitist douchebag. Yeah. That's an exact quote. But I think that's the general perception, is that this guy he's a weirdo, and he is weird. He's a weird guy. Have you ever seen him? If you ever get a chance in the future, I'm going to take you there. Every year they do the agricultural fair outside of Paris, where you go and the politicians show up and they pat the cows and shake the farmers' hands and stuff. It's a lot of fun. It's a great place to go. And there's a lot of cool farm technology companies that go there too, as a brief aside. But man, he looks awkward when he shows up.
My favorite, not that we need to just have a shitting on Macron party here, but when the Ukraine war, I don't want to say what, I mean, it's still at its height, but early on in the Ukraine war, where Macron wanted to be seen in the sweat, like the same uniform that Zelensky was wearing, and then you saw Macron and he hadn't shaved and he was in the hoodie, like almost like a Bill Belichick stalking the halls of Versailles. I thought that was pretty funny. We're throwing a lot of shade at Macron. Like, he is a very skilled politician. He's a very, very smart guy. He's smarter than a lot of the European leaders and politicians that are out there. I mean, just look at what is happening in the United Kingdom right now, and you can see an example of a real clown show. But yeah, I mean, I think Macron has some lessons for other European leaders and some things that just don't translate. Like, France is very different from that point of view. I'll also say, though, that I think Macron, much better than certainly anyone in Germany, does a very good job of articulating to the French people why the European Union is important. He may look down on the Eastern Europeans and say things in the wrong ways, but he also very clearly understands that if France is to be as glorious as he wants it to be, France has to be a leader of Europe. It can't just be on its own. And that, I think he's made his case to the French people over and over again. And I think he's actually one of the reasons skepticism in the European Union and France has been stemmed a little bit, because he really does see that and sees France as playing a leadership role in that context. It'll be really interesting to see how Italy goes. And to bring this back to the Italy part of the conversation, I mean, Mario Draghi is not a politician. I mean, Macron is a politician. He's a weird one. He has his warts, but he's a politician. Draghi's not. Nobody's going to elect that guy prime minister. He's really like a wonky dude who just cares about the bond yields and the reforms and things like that. And that's not natural. Now we're going to see if there's anybody in Italy who has the political stones to wed a strategic worldview with enough political skill to get into a position like Macron. I doubt it. Italy doesn't normally create governments like that.
Well, I think that's the message, excuse me, from the book, The Revolt of the Public, as well. You know, sort of his proscription is, or prescription, I should say, is that this is only going to resolve itself when you start to have leaders who are humble and approachable and, you know, quote unquote populist in the sense of being of the people for real, but who marry that with a strategic sense, a commonsensical approach, and a message that is not just let's destroy what exists, what's there already, but let's build something. And, you know, we'll try this. We may screw up. I don't know everything. We don't know everything, but this is worth pursuing.
Yeah, I just said, yeah, I'm trying to cure myself from saying yeah when I answer questions. It's how I avoid saying at the beginning. But I realized the other day I was listening to an interview of myself and I said yeah every time I said something. So I need to cure myself of that. Just sharing that tidbit with you listeners in case you're wondering what's going on in my brain when I'm talking. I think the politics of the world right now is creating opportunities for those types of politicians, but they're very, very few and far between. It's rare that you get an exceptional individual who's in the right place at the right time. For various other reasons, I've been thinking a lot about Franklin Delano Roosevelt recently, just because I've been reading some books about that time period. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is as patrician as they come, a total aristocrat, came from all the money in the world, had nothing in common with the common man or woman in the United States. But really did have a sense of where he wanted the country to go and was willing to moderate his views or do things in the face of an economic crisis that most people in his class not only wouldn't have done, they considered him a traitor for even considering. Flip that around, though. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt reportedly said the two most dangerous people in the United States were Huey Long and Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is a general. We can talk about him later. Huey Long was a populist politician from Louisiana, from my stomping grounds. And he was a true populist. He came from nothing. He came up and was all about let's build infrastructure and let's build roads and let's do all these other sorts of things. But he was a born demagogue. He was incredibly charismatic. And when he actually got into power, he wasn't really, I mean, he was in his head fighting for the common man in his own way, but it didn't get translated the same way that FDR's big programs eventually did and actually did help a large number of Americans. So I bring that up just to say that it's very rare to get an FDR figure who's in the right place at the right time, who has enough support to push through the types of reforms that are needed, who has his feet in both the common man's world and in the rich person's world, and can communicate that in a way that actually works at a policy level. Those types of politicians are extremely rare. So if we're waiting around for those types of politicians, honestly, we're in trouble, because it's not a sure thing those types of folks are going to come around.
But it's a good question, because as you described geopolitics, it's about the structural underpinnings of a situation. And in this case, your analysis is that the EU wants to come together. It needs to come together. Many, many forces are pushing these countries together. And I think that's something that a lot of people can understand. Are you dependent on the right people coming together in the right combination to actually make that work? Or is that going to happen? It's the great man versus the structural question. Marco would say that the people won't matter very much, and that it's going to happen regardless. I know you put more weight on the individual, but where do you come out on the EU question specifically?
So I struggle with that question literally every day of my life. And depending what's going on and what I've been reading or what I had for breakfast that day, I can spout out a different answer, and each one sounds equally well considered and brilliant. I think the only thing that I shy away from is anybody who has a sure answer to that question, because there is no sure answer. And you can even, the elegant cop-out to that question is, well, individuals are just produced by their circumstance. So even the great man or the great woman is really just comes from a community who was conditioned by certain ideas, and in some ways is really the reflection of that community. I actually do think that to a certain extent. In the United States, for instance, when there were all those protests when Trump first got elected and they were yelling, "Not my president." Yes, he is. That's the president of the United States, who the majority of the folks elect. Maybe you don't like the Electoral College. Maybe you think it's offensive, but no, that's the representation of the United States, just like 8 years before it was Obama. We contain multitudes as a people. But on the flip side, I do think that there are moments in time where the individual absolutely does matter. The Russia-Ukraine war is all about Vladimir Putin. And yes, we can talk about how he's a product of Russia in a particular place and a particular time. But history will remember Vladimir Putin, and he has changed the course of European history because of what he decided to do, because of what his analysis of the situation was, and because of the power that he had and the decisions that he made. As for the European Union, look, the European Union is so unwieldy that there's not going to be one politician who's going to unite all of those countries. Most of those countries can't even unite themselves. So in that sense, the structural forces really do push them together. So I don't think the European Union, in some ways, the European Union is even less dependent on an individual leader than the rest of the world, because it's not one country. It's this group of a bunch of different countries, and you don't need that one leader. What you really need is the most important countries in the European Union to get on the same page and push in the same direction. And I still think that's the case. I could be wrong. It could be that domestic politics in places like Germany and France and Italy prevent those countries from doing what the geopolitical forces say that they should. There's plenty of examples of countries doing things that are not in their interests in the long run. And there are threats like that. If you got, we're talking about the great man or the right woman in the right place at the right time. There's also, the wrong person in the right place at the right time. So if you had somebody who didn't give a crap about what's going to happen to the Italians, but he somehow convinced enough Italians to vote for him so that he could try and lead Italy out of the European Union, then that one crazy person could maybe really affect what we're talking about. What's a good example of this? What was the guy? I'm forgetting which. Was it the Philippines? Somebody who was just really good at TikTok. Colombia almost elected this random right-wing guy at the very last moment in their elections because he was really good at TikTok. And eventually they went with Petro, who's left-leaning communist sort of background, which has its own other can of worms. But there's an example of just all the contingencies that are involved that can shake up a geopolitical analysis and go with the structural forces. So I don't have an easy answer there, but I still think that when it comes to the European Union, the structural forces outweigh any of the personalities or the demagogues that I see.
So what do you think about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as U.S. presidential candidate? Is that a... You don't have to answer that.
This is where I say, like, people often ask me what I do, and I say I'm a political analyst, and they go, and usually in the United States, people don't know what to say at that point because they're like, "Ooh, what side is he on?" That you can like see them weighing it in their eyes when they're talking to me, and I'm like,
they're looking to see if you're wearing a bow tie or not.
You don't knock bow ties till you try it. But I always tell them at this point, don't worry, I do global politics. I don't have to do anything about the United States. Like, people don't come to me for insights about the United States that much. So Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, whatever. It's all kind of the same to me. I think we could do better, but we could certainly do worse.
We could.
I think we should probably come close to putting a pin in it there. Anything else on your mind, Rob, before we say goodbye to the listeners and I get back to my peacocks over here?
No, I don't think so. Just a reminder that if you haven't already, Jacob writes his weekly global situation report, and you should go to our website and sign up for that if you are not, because it is a really tight encapsulation of everything that's happened in the week and what Jacob's analysis of it is, that you can read in about 20 minutes on a Saturday morning. So go for it.
And I'll also do something very unnatural for me and promotional because I'm trying to be better about this. If you've gotten to the end of this podcast and you're interested in the things that we've said about investments and our positions and things like that, the way that Cognitive Investments makes money is that it manages people's money. So if any of this has if you want to talk more about that, Rob at cognitive.investments, Jacob at cognitive.investments. I'm not going to bang your head over how you need to do stuff with us. I'm just happy to have you all here listening and having this community of folks who are not listening to MSNBC or Fox News or whatever other horrible media sources are out there. But if you're interested in that investment point, if you want to talk more about what that looks like, don't hesitate to reach out to us. It's literally what we do. All of the conversations Rob and I are having are just the product of doing all the research and the discipline of investing. And we're here talking at the end of the day, sharing it with you because we think it's interesting. So how did I do? Was that good, Rob? I'm trying,
that was good.
All right, cool.
Becoming
I hope the
real salesman.
I hope the listeners. Oh, please not. I hope the listeners don't hate me now. You probably do. Okay, guys, we'll get out of here. And apologies again if this comes out a little late. Rob, I will talk to you next week.
Sounds good, Jacob.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.